You're not going to believe this. Dr. Phil just showed a mirror to the View panelists exposing a duplicity of narrative on children's safety that flies in the face of their stances on the border crisis versus the pandemic. And you know what makes this clip stand out the most? Dr. Phil has been on a roll lately, and I think we may have just witnessed him be the only guest to have finally turned the audience to his side, away from applauding anything and everything that the cackling hens have to say. Let's just get into it.
My understanding is that you went to the southern border. Now you're saying that you're going to give people facts. What did you take away from that experience, and what kind of reporting are you going to be bringing back from that experience?
I'll tell you a fact I took away. I talked to the head of all the border guards down there, the head of the union. I asked him straight up, kids are coming over the border with numbers written on them, phone numbers and addresses. Do we check those out? He said, well, we call them. Is it possible that we're sending them into known prostitution rings or sweatshops? He said, it's not possible, it is absolute. We are using American tax dollars to ship children into known prostitution and sweatshops.
Some children.
Well, who knows?
That admission alone is enough to shock anyone, but I want you to notice the callousness to it from Sonny Hostin, and remember it as context for what I'll show you next. Here's the bitter truth that no one seems to want to face. In just the last 2 years under the disastrous immigration and border policies, 85,000 children have gone missing after crossing into the United States. Think of that number again, 85,000, because every single one of those children is easy picking for the multitude of child trafficking rings that operate in the region. 85,000 children is enough to fill up a large football stadium, and yet unfortunately, because it's a political issue, it falls prey to the same politicking from The View. For the criminal cartels and child trafficking rings luring helpless migrant children, they made over $14 million every single day, according to a report in 2021. Do you start to see just how huge the black market is for this? It's easy to bicker over the current border crisis to the end of time, but the ultimate human cost of it is being borne by migrant children.
But what kind of checking do they do? So
they call the number and say, do you know about this child? They say yes. Will you receive them when they come? Yes. I said, is it possible that that's a prostitution ring? He said, we know enough to know that in a number of cases, it has turned out to be absolute sex ring. It has turned out to be an absolute sweatshop. I said, how is this possible?
Well, what do they do?
And he said, it is happening.
What do they do then if they know that that's happening? Where is the U.S. Attorney's Office? Where is the...
Here's the good question,
you have to re-ask that question when we come back, because we're coming back with more.
I just don't sense the panel truly understanding the gravity of what Dr. Phil just said there, and it becomes all the more apparent when you look at how adamant and opinionated they are when talking about the school lockdowns during the pandemic. But first, take a moment to truly understand what the border crisis is doing. It is making the Americans' taxpayer money go toward funding an incompetence on the border issues that results in an unspeakable human cost. If you know who Tim Ballard is, you probably understand the incredible work that he's done in fighting the scourge of child trafficking on the front lines, and it's through him his organization called Operation Underground Railroad and films like Sound of Freedom made about him that we've truly understood this angle to the border crisis that very few people even knew. That's because cartels and rings have found major loopholes in the US immigration systems, agencies, and policies, allowing them to use the porous border as a prime recruitment ground for stranded and unaccompanied migrant children. Here's how they do it. The American Border Patrol realized a few years ago that they were finding children with phone numbers written on their arms. It was found that the parents or guardians of these children had written down these details to make sure they can be reunited with a relative in the United States in case they are lost in transit and border crossings. What's crazy is that there's very little background checking or verification of these individuals that come from the mainland US to claim they're related to these children, and they're allowed to just take them away. Predictably, it's a loophole being exploited by criminal cartels who write false details on children's arms before they're apprehended by the Border Patrol agents, only then to come back and claim these children as their own. I want you to picture that absolute helplessness of the children being made victim to these heinous crimes, and then compare the underreaction of the View panelists to the overreaction over a different topic. That was the reaction that ended in the hasty closing down of children's schools for nearly 2 years in some places, that resulted in great physical and psychological distress for those children, despite solid evidence at the time that young children were the least affected or transmissive of the virus.
Like 08, 09, smartphones came on, and kids stopped living their lives and started watching people live their lives. And so we saw the biggest spike and the highest levels of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and suicidality since records have ever been kept. And it's just continued on and on and on. And then COVID hits 10 years later, and the same agencies that knew that are the agencies that shut down the schools for 2 years. Who does that? Who takes away the support system for these children? Who takes them away and shuts it down?
Isn't that what's wrong with much of our political discourse around a topic like this? No one's willing to admit that there's a trade-off to even the most well-intentioned policies before having the hard discussion on it. On the issue of children's schools and playgrounds remaining closed for years on end, the cure proved to be far worse than the disease. It is estimated that American teenagers, the isolation they experienced ended up doubling the rates of depression and anxiety in the age group, especially among girls. Perhaps even irreversibly in that formative age. For a bit of context, it was confirmed by multiple studies in both 2020 and 2021 that children were the least at risk of the virus and transmission by nearly half as much as adults. Not at all were they super spreaders or even a group that had much to worry about apart from those with compromised immune systems from a prior underlying condition. And that's the picture you see when you look at the statistics around the total number of people that have passed away in the United States in 3.5 years since the pandemic started. In the approximately 1.1 million people that have lost their lives from the pandemic, just around 1,600 were under the age of 17. That's 0.4%. The number for those that were over the age of 65 stands around 857,000, which is 77% of the total. I know it's hard to do these kind of crude and cold calculations on human life, but the fact is that policymakers at the top have to keep these truths and stats in mind when deciding which is the risk and cost analysis. But a panel like The View is the last place that you can expect to bring these vital facts into a debate that can too often be led by blind compassion or fear-mongering.
There was also a pandemic going on, and they were trying to save
kids' lives. Remember, we know a lot of folks who died during this, so it wasn't, people weren't laying around eating bond, but, well, you know what? We're lucky. Maybe we're lucky they didn't, because we kept them out of the places that they could be sick, because no one wanted to believe we had an issue.
Are you saying no school children died of COVID?
I'm saying it was the safest group. They were the less vulnerable group, and they suffered and will suffer more from the mismanagement of COVID than they will from the exposure to COVID. And that's not an opinion, that's a fact.
I bet the hosts were not expecting to see this side of Dr. Phil. Notice the applause he gets there at the end, almost stealing away the panel's audience from them. Dr. Phil in recent months has shed the burden of his media persona to speak the cold, hard truth that he believes in. That's what we saw when he was on Joe Rogan just a few days ago, and now it's on The View. If you watch the entire episode, you know how there's just that degree of distance and uncomfortableness on the panel, with the unapologetic way that Dr. Phil disagreed with them on a variety of issues. But perhaps when the truth seems so lost and elusive, it's that hard-hitting manner of conversation that can help us make some sense of it all.